I've chosen the story Rooftoppers by Catherine Rundell. It's one of my favourite stories because it's set in Paris, which is one of my favourite cities, and there is a real mystery to the opening chapter. On the first morning of its first birthday, a baby was found floating in a cello case in the middle of the English Channel. It was the only living thing for miles, just the baby and some dining room chairs and the tip of a ship disappearing into the ocean. There had been music in the dining hall, and it was music so loud and so good that nobody had noticed the water flooding in over the carpet. The violins went on sawing for some time after the screaming had begun. Sometimes the shriek of a passenger would duet with a high C. The baby was found wrapped for warmth in the musical score of a Beethoven symphony. It had drifted almost a mile from the ship and was the last to be rescued. The man who lifted it into the rescue boat was a fellow passenger and a scholar. It's a scholar's job to notice things. He noticed that it was a girl with hair the colour of lightning and the smile of a shy person. Think of night time with the speaking voice, or think how moonlight might talk, or think of ink if ink had vocal cords. Give those things a narrow aristocratic face with hooked eyebrows and long arms and legs. And that is what the baby saw as she was lifted out of her cello case and up into safety. His name was Charles Maxim, and he determined as he held her in his large hands at arm's length as he would a leaky flower pot, that he would keep her. The baby was almost certainly 1 year old. They knew this because of the red rosette pinned to her front, which read 1. Or rather, said Charles Maxim, the child is either 1 year old or she has come first in a competition. I believe babies are rarely keen participants in competitive sport. Shall we therefore assume it is the former? The girl held on to his earlobe with a grubby finger and thumb. Happy birthday, my child, he said. Charles did not only give the baby a birthday, he also gave her a name. He chose Sophie on that first day on the grounds that nobody could possibly object to it. Your day has been dramatic and extraordinary enough, child, he said. It might be best to have the most extraordinary name available. You can be Mary or Betty or Sophie or at a stretch Mildred, your choice. Sophie had smiled when he said Sophie, so Sophie it was. Then he fetched his coat and folded her up in it and took her home in a carriage. It rained a little, but it did not worry either of them. Charles did not generally notice the weather, and Sophie had already survived a lot of water that day. Charles had never really known a child before. He told Sophie as much on the way home. I do, I'm afraid, understand books far more readily than I understand people. Books are so easy to get along with. The carriage ride took 4 hours. Charles held Sophie on the very edge of his knee and told her about himself as though she were an acquaintance at a tea party. He was 36 years old and 6'3". He spoke English to people and French to cats and Latin to the birds. He had once nearly killed himself trying to read and ride a horse at the same time. But I will be more careful, he said, now that there is you, little cello child. Charles's home was beautiful, but it was not safe. It was all staircases and slippery floorboards and sharp corners. I'll buy some smaller chairs, he said, and we'll have thick red carpets. Although, how does one go about acquiring carpets? I don't suppose you know, Sophie. Unsurprisingly, Sophie did not answer. She was too young to talk and she was asleep. She woke up when they drew up in a street smelling of trees and horse dung. Sophie loved the house at first sight. The bricks were painted the brightest white in London and shone even in the dark. The basement was used to store the overflow of books and paintings and several brands of spiders, and the roof belonged to the birds. Charles lived in the space in between. At home, after a hot bath, in front of the stove, Sophie looked very white and fragile. Charles had not known that a baby was so terrifyingly tiny a thing. She felt too small in his arms. He was almost relieved when there was a knock at the door. He lay Sophie down carefully on a chair with a Shakespearean play as a booster seat and went up the stairs, 2 at a time.